The impacts of addiction on rural communities was the topic of discussion in Russell today. Western Mass News reporter Olivia Hickey joining us in studio after hearing from one of the participants. Olivia.
Senator John Velis says during the closed-door, hours-long discussion, he heard about struggles firsthand from providers, recovery coaches, and others working in the field, and what's hindering people from accessing needed resources. Two big factors, he says, are workforce challenges and reliable transportation.
There just is not the transportation in the rural communities that there are in other parts of the state. You have an individual that could raise their hand and literally say the three hardest but most courageous words, "I need help," but not have anywhere to turn.
This roundtable discussion comes after the Department of Public Health released data late last year that shows increasingly high rates of opioid-related overdose deaths in rural communities. That data is now on your screen. Urban communities are shown in blue, with the most deaths shown by the red line, which is the least populated rural areas, and the green line showing the more populated rural communities. Velis emphasized the importance of collaboration on a community, state, and federal level, so people can access essential resources.
People are dying in the rural communities, and we need to be mindful of that. And as we're handing out funding sources and providing funds, we need to realize that just because you don't see the abundance of numbers as you do in other parts of the state, that those deaths are still ripping apart families, and every life matters.
So what's next? Velis tells us they're in the process of drafting a substance use disorder bill. Listening to people impacted by addiction in any capacity, he says, will help in that process. Velis believes there is a broad consensus between the Senate and the House that too many lives are being lost to addiction. Reporting live in the studio, Olivia Hickey for Western Mass News.